The Greenvale Orphanage housed dozens, but none were ever registered since 1912. The rain fell steadily on the cracked asphalt of Maple Street as Sarah Chun pulled her rental car to a stop outside the rusted gates of what locals still called the Old Orphanage. The building loomed before her, its Gothic Revival architecture casting long shadows even in the dim afternoon light. Broken windows stared down like hollow eyes, and ivy claimed the brick walls with an almost aggressive persistence. Sarah had been chasing this story for 3 months now, ever since a routine records audit at the Connecticut State Archives had revealed something impossible: a building permit from 1912 for the Greenvale Children's Home, followed by decades of property tax records, utility bills, and municipal correspondence, but absolutely no documentation of the children who supposedly lived there. The initial discovery had come from Margaret Thompson, an elderly archivist who'd spent 40 years organizing Connecticut's historical documents. While digitizing old municipal records, she'd noticed the discrepancy: hundreds of references to the orphanage's operations, supply deliveries, staff payroll, and even complaints from neighbors about excessive noise from the children's activities. Yet no birth certificates, death certificates, admission records, or transfer documents for any children whatsoever. This wasn't simply a case of poor record keeping. State law had required detailed documentation of orphaned children since 1889, following a national scandal involving child labor exploitation. Every legitimate orphanage in Connecticut had meticulous records, dating back to the 1890s. Every orphanage. Except Greenvale. Sarah's investigation had led her through a maze of bureaucratic dead ends. The original charter for the Greenvale Children's Home had been filed by Theodore Blackwood, a prominent businessman who'd made his fortune in textile manufacturing. The paperwork described the facility designed to house up to 60 children, with plans for dormitories, a dining hall, classrooms, and recreational areas. Construction had been completed in the winter of 1912, and the facility had supposedly operated continuously until 1987, when it was quietly closed following what municipal records described only as administrative issues. Yet despite 75 years of operation, not a single child's name appeared in any official documentation. The mystery deepened when Sarah discovered that the Greenvale Children's Home had received regular funding from the state of Connecticut throughout its operational period. Budget allocations showed consistent payments for child welfare services, with amounts that suggested the facility housed between 40 and 50 children at any given time. The payments had been substantial, often exceeding those made to larger, well-documented orphanages in Hartford and New Haven. Where had this money gone? And more importantly, where were the children? Sarah's attempts to locate former staff members had yielded little concrete information. Most were deceased, and those few relatives she'd managed to contact claimed to know nothing about the orphanage's operations. The responses followed a disturbing pattern: awkward silences, quickly ended phone calls, and a surprising number of people who claimed their deceased relatives had never talked about work. The only exception had been Dorothy Henley, the 87-year-old niece of a former groundskeeper. Dorothy had been reluctant to speak initially, but eventually admitted that her uncle had worked at Greenvale from 1952 to 1971. According to Dorothy, her uncle had been a quiet man who'd suffered from what the family now recognized as severe PTSD. He'd rarely spoken about his work, but Dorothy remembered fragments of disturbing conversations, mentions of special deliveries that arrived at night, underground rooms that weren't on any building plans, and children who came and went without paperwork. The most chilling detail Dorothy shared was her uncle's habit of leaving flowers at a small cemetery plot on the anniversary of his retirement from Greenvale. The plot was unmarked, located in a forgotten corner of Greenvale Municipal Cemetery, and according to cemetery records, had been purchased by the Children's Home in 1914. No names were associated with the burial site, which was officially listed as reserved for institutional use. Sarah had visited the cemetery the previous week. The unmarked plot was larger than she'd expected, roughly 50 feet by 30 feet, and covered with decades of accumulated leaves and debris. The groundskeeper, a man in his 60s who'd worked there for over 30 years, confirmed that someone had been leaving flowers at the site regularly until about 15 years ago, when the visits had stopped. Now, standing before the orphanage itself, Sarah felt the weight of her investigation pressing down on her. She'd obtained legal permission to enter the building through a lengthy process involving the current property owner, a holding company that had purchased the building in 1988 and left it vacant ever since. The company's lawyers had been strangely eager to accommodate her request, almost as if they were relieved that someone was finally willing to investigate the property's history. The front door of the orphanage opened with surprising ease, its hinges well-oiled, despite the building's apparent abandonment. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a grand entrance hall with a curved staircase that had once been elegant but now showed decades of neglect. The walls were lined with faded photographs, their subjects obscured by moisture damage and time. As Sarah moved deeper into the building, she began to notice details that didn't align with typical orphanage architecture. The windows were fitted with locks that could only be opened from the outside. The doors to what should have been children's dormitories were equipped with heavy deadbolts. Most disturbing of all, the basement access was secured with a modern electronic lock system that seemed entirely out of place in a building supposedly abandoned since 1987. The main floor revealed a maze of rooms whose purposes were unclear. What appeared to be a dining hall was equipped with tables that were bolted to the floor, and the kitchen showed signs of industrial-scale food preparation, far beyond what would be needed for 60 children. A room labeled Medical Wing contained examining tables with leather restraints and medicine cabinets that had been emptied but not cleaned, leaving behind residue from unknown substances. Sarah's unease grew as she discovered that the building's layout didn't match the original architectural plans she'd obtained from the municipal archives. Rooms appeared where none should exist, corridors led to dead ends, and entire sections of the building seemed to have been added without permits or documentation. The building permits from 1912 showed a straightforward 3-story structure, but Sarah was exploring what appeared to be a 4-story building with a basement that extended far beyond the foundation's supposed boundaries. The second floor housed what had presumably been the children's dormitories. Sarah counted 12 rooms, each containing between 6 and 8 metal bed frames. The beds were arranged in precise rows, creating an institutional atmosphere that felt more like a prison than a home. Each bed was equipped with leather restraints at the wrists and ankles, and the windows were not just locked but permanently sealed with metal bars that had been welded into place. In one dormitory, Sarah discovered a collection of children's belongings that had been left behind: worn shoes, faded clothing, and small toys carved from wood. The items were arranged as if the children had simply vanished, leaving behind only these silent witnesses to their existence. Carbon dating would later confirm that these artifacts dated from various periods between 1915 and 1980, suggesting continuous occupancy throughout the orphanage's operational years. The third floor contained what appeared to be administrative offices and staff quarters. Sarah found filing cabinets filled with documents that painted a disturbing picture of the orphanage's true nature. Purchase orders revealed regular deliveries of medical supplies, including large quantities of sedatives and anesthetics. Correspondence with various institutions discussed specimen quality and developmental stages in language that suggested the children were being treated as research subjects rather than wards of the state. Most damning of all was a series of contracts with universities and pharmaceutical companies dating from the 1920s through the 1970s. These documents detailed agreements for developmental research and behavioral studies involving the orphanage's residents. The contract specified that subjects would remain anonymous and that all research would be conducted without external oversight or documentation. As Sarah photographed these documents, she began to understand the horrifying truth about Greenvale. The orphanage had never been a legitimate care facility. It had been a supply source for human experimentation, housing children who had been deliberately erased from official records to prevent outside scrutiny. The lack of documentation wasn't an oversight. It was a carefully maintained system, designed to provide researchers with test subjects who would never be missed. The implications were staggering. For over 70 years, children had been brought to Greenvale and subjected to medical experiments, psychological testing, and other forms of research without consent, oversight, or even basic documentation of their existence. When the experiments were complete, the children simply disappeared, leaving no trace that they had ever lived. Sarah's investigation had uncovered one of the most systematic and long-lasting violations of human rights in American history, and she was only beginning to understand its scope. The basement of the Greenvale Children's Home revealed the full extent of the horror Sarah had been investigating. Her locksmith had managed to bypass the electronic security system, opening access to areas that had been sealed since the facility's closure in 1987. What she found below the ground floor would forever change her understanding of the depths of human cruelty. The basement was far more extensive than the building's footprint suggested, with corridors that stretched deep underground and connected to what appeared to be a network of bunkers and laboratories. The walls were lined with medical equipment that belonged in a hospital, not an orphanage. Surgical tables, X-ray machines, and monitoring devices that had been abandoned but not removed. The air carried the lingering scent of disinfectant and something else, something organic and disturbing that Sarah couldn't identify. In the first laboratory, Sarah discovered detailed medical charts documenting experiments conducted on children, identified only by numbers. Subject 1247 had been a 7-year-old girl subjected to repeated doses of experimental vaccines. Subject 1312 had been a 12-year-old boy used to test the effects of radiation exposure. The charts detailed symptoms, dosages, and outcomes with clinical precision, but never once mentioned the children's names, backgrounds, or what had ultimately happened to them. The experiments had been conducted over decades with different research focuses corresponding to the changing interests of the scientific and medical communities. In the 1920s and 1930s, the focus had been on nutritional studies and growth development. The 1940s and 1950s had seen psychological experimentation, including sensory deprivation and behavioral modification. The 1960s through 1980s had brought pharmaceutical testing and studies on the effects of various chemical compounds. Sarah found contracts linking the Greenvale facility to some of the most prestigious universities in the United States. Harvard Medical School, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Pennsylvania had all conducted research using children from the orphanage. The contracts were signed by department heads and research directors, whose names appeared on medical textbooks and academic journals that were still in use today. The pharmaceutical connections were even more disturbing. Major drug companies had used Greenvale children to test medications that were later approved for public use. Antidepressants, vaccines, and pain medications that millions of Americans had taken had been tested on children who had no legal existence and no protection. Under medical ethics guidelines. In a filing cabinet marked acquisition records, Sarah discovered how the children had been obtained. The system had been sophisticated and involved multiple institutions across the country. Pregnant women in desperate situations had been offered shelter and medical care in exchange for signing over their parental rights. Children from other orphanages had been transferred to Greenvale under false pretenses, their original records destroyed or altered. Some children had been obtained through illegal adoption networks that promised loving homes but delivered them to Greenvale instead. The most heartbreaking discovery was a room Sarah found at the end of the basement corridor. It contained hundreds of small wooden boxes, each marked with a number and a date. Inside each box were personal items: a lock of hair, a baby tooth, a small toy, along with a brief medical summary. These were the only remaining evidence of the children who had lived and died at Greenvale. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened box after box, each one representing a life that had been stolen and exploited. The dates ranged from 1913 to 1987, spanning the entire operational period of the orphanage. The medical summaries revealed that many children had died during experiments, while others had been transferred to other facilities when they were no longer useful for research purposes. Investigation into what had happened to the surviving children led Sarah to a network of institutions across the country. Using the limited information from the boxes, she was able to trace some children to psychiatric hospitals, where they had been committed under false names and subjected to additional experimentation. Others had been sent to facilities that specialized in housing individuals with severe developmental disabilities, often disabilities that had been caused by the experiments conducted at Greenvale. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Sarah discovered that the Greenvale operation had been part of a larger network of facilities that had operated throughout the United States, all serving the same purpose: providing researchers with human test subjects who existed outside the normal legal and ethical frameworks. The network had been coordinated by a private organization called the Institute for Developmental Research, which had been funded by a combination of government grants, university partnerships, and pharmaceutical company contracts. The Institute's records, which Sarah obtained through a series of Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed that the Greenvale facility had been considered one of their most successful operations. It had provided subjects for over 200 published research studies, contributed to the development of dozens of medications and medical procedures, and had maintained its secrecy for over 7 decades. The closure of Greenvale in 1987 hadn't been due to discovery of the illegal activities, but rather to changing research methodologies and increased scrutiny of institutional research practices. The facility had been quietly shut down, its records sealed or destroyed, and its surviving residents transferred to other institutions where they could continue to be monitored and studied. Sarah's investigation revealed that some of the Greenvale children were still alive, now elderly individuals living in care facilities under names that weren't their own. Through careful detective work, she was able to locate 3 survivors, each of whom had been subjected to decades of experimentation that had left them with severe physical and psychological trauma. The first survivor, a woman now in her 70s, had been brought to Greenvale as an infant in 1951. She had been subjected to nutritional experiments that had stunted her growth and caused permanent cognitive impairment. She had no memory of her original name or family, having been raised knowing only her subject number. Despite her limitations, she was able to provide Sarah with details about daily life at the orphanage that confirmed the worst aspects of her investigation. The second survivor, a man in his 60s, had been used for pharmaceutical testing from age 8 to 16. The experimental drugs had caused permanent neurological damage, but he retained clear memories of the medical procedures and could describe the underground laboratories in detail. His testimony provided crucial corroboration for Sarah's findings about the extent of the medical experimentation. The third survivor, a woman in her late 60s, had been part of psychological experiments designed to test the effects of isolation and sensory deprivation. She had been kept in solitary confinement for months at a time, monitored through hidden cameras and subjected to various forms of psychological manipulation. Her testimony revealed the systematic nature of the psychological abuse and its lasting impact on the survivors. Sarah's investigation culminated in a series of revelations that exposed one of the most comprehensive violations of human rights in American history. The Greenvale Children's Home had been the center of a decades-long conspiracy involving prestigious universities, major pharmaceutical companies, and government agencies. Hundreds of children have been subjected to medical and psychological experimentation. Without consent, oversight, or even basic documentation of their existence, the story Sarah ultimately published sparked national outrage and led to congressional hearings, criminal investigations, and civil lawsuits. Several universities were forced to acknowledge their involvement and establish funds to compensate survivors. Pharmaceutical companies faced criminal charges for their role in the illegal experimentation. The Institute for Developmental Research was disbanded and its records were made public, revealing the full scope of the network of facilities that had operated throughout the country. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was the recognition finally given to the children of Greenvale. Their names, those that could be recovered, were engraved on a memorial erected at the site of the former orphanage. The unmarked cemetery plot was properly dedicated, and the children who had died were finally acknowledged as human beings who had deserved protection, care, and dignity. The Greenvale Children's Home was demolished in 2024. But its legacy serves as a reminder of the importance of oversight, documentation, and ethical standards in research involving vulnerable populations. The children who lived and died there were finally given the recognition they had been denied in life, and their story serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing any institution to operate without accountability or transparency. Sarah's investigation had taken 2 years to complete, but it had succeeded in bringing light to one of the darkest chapters in American institutional history. The children of Greenvale would never be forgotten again. Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,